We have a representative of the government online now to talk to us.
Yes, there's been a change of plans for many holidaymakers. Portugal is back in play. You'll no longer need to quarantine for 14 days when you return, but Croatia, Austria, Trinidad and Tobago have been taken off the travel corridor list. Also, news this morning about smart motorways. The government is announcing plans for more of them and a specialist unit to accelerate road and rail upgrades. On that and more, we can speak to Transport Secretary Grant Shapps. Morning.
Morning. Can I just correct something actually
Oh,
on the
yeah, go
smart
on.
motor? I have literally no idea where that story's come from, apart from the fact I read it in the newspaper. It's actually not true. The smart motorway program was subject to quite a comprehensive stock-taking review that I did end of last year because I had concerns over their safety record, and I made 18 recommendations after an intensive study into them, all of which need to be fulfilled before we can carry on building them. So one part, you're right about the rest of it. I'm announcing an acceleration unit to get things build faster today in lots of ways, but smart motorways is not one of those things.
So you
We
don't
will
want
be.
any more smart motorways?
It's not that we don't want any more, but to give you a simple example, I've got one in my constituency that was due to be built, happens to be one of the many around the country. That's actually been delayed by several years because they now need to adhere to the new higher standards for smart motorways. So yeah, I was surprised to see that story this morning, but it's actually just not true.
Well, thanks for putting us right. But I wonder just more broadly on that subject, what you make of the incredible delays to this kind of thing and the reason for you having to set up this acceleration unit. We were hearing from our transport correspondent a little bit earlier on, and he was saying, the road under Stonehenge was first proposed in 1995. HS2 is massively delayed. Crossrail is massively delayed. Why are we, throughout the ages, so poor at getting these things done on time?
Yeah, and that is exactly the question for the acceleration unit that I'm setting up today. So in the week on Wednesday, I went to see the exact opposite of all that, actually, the A14, not celebrated enough. It's just been opened between Huntingdon and Cambridge. It's 21 miles dual carriageway, 30 plus bridges, tunnels, etc. And it's a mega project. So it's £1.5 billion road project, the biggest thing that's been built since I think the M40 was upgraded. And it was delivered 8 months ahead of schedule. Unheard of. So I've been there, studied that, set up this acceleration unit with the purpose of understanding when things do go right, and I accept that it doesn't happen anywhere near as much as it should when the government's building stuff. How has that happened, and how can we replicate it elsewhere on HS2 and all the rest of it? So that's actually what I'm announcing today, and the acceleration units born for this purpose.
Back to the latest travel restrictions that were announced yesterday. We spoke to our transport correspondent, Graham Payton, earlier on in the show, and he was talking about, I think it's 2 people who've actually faced charges for breaking quarantine restrictions. They aren't really being enforced, are they?
Certainly, I got caught in the quarantine that I imposed on Spain on the first day I arrived there, and sent myself home again and started my quarantine. My family came home later. They completed the holiday, came home, and my wife actually received a call from Border Force, as did another member of the family, to find out, they knew what was happening, etc. And it is important that people know that if you break the quarantine, that is a criminal offence. You
But
can
do
get
you
a
think this
criminal
might be? Do you think this might be just because she was your wife, with
No,
respect? Because I
did
haven't heard of many other people getting calls at all. It's not something
I did point to
that's
that,
come
but
up.
no, it was a random pick, and not everybody will get calls. But it is important to remind people. Not only is there are 2 things. There's something called the passenger locator form, which is a form that you must now complete when you return to this country, regardless of whether you're coming to a country which requires you to quarantine or not. And that's a legal duty and responsibility. And I'm working with the airlines and the airports and the travel booking companies to make sure they remind people that's required. That's so we can get in touch with people if they've been in contact with somebody, perhaps somebody on the let's say somebody on the flight was later found to have coronavirus. We've got to be able to contact them. And then the second thing is you must quarantine if you're coming back from one of these countries. It's a criminal offence not to. And although you mentioned the numbers are low at the moment, Border Force will be in charge of that. They release their numbers, I think, in retrospect, and I suspect the numbers will be becoming much higher than that, I would imagine, because enforcement is their bag. But by and large, people usually try to do the right thing in this country. It's important people do because it's about saving lives.
Would you like to see those numbers higher?
Well, actually, I'd like to sit in the zero and have everybody comply. But I am aware, I'm naive about these things, that the people sometimes think this doesn't apply and that perhaps I don't need to quarantine. And the thing is, we've got our numbers down to put a number on it, 11 cases per 100,000 of the population measured over 7 days. And the countries that are in quarantine all have over 20 cases per 100,000, and some now very much higher, like Spain, for example, that I put into quarantine is now very much higher. And if you come back from those countries and you don't quarantine, then you are running the risk that you end up unwittingly spreading coronavirus, probably to somebody that probably to a loved one, actually, and you can put their lives at risk. So, it really is a duty on everybody, I think.
Can you spell out what resources you have put into checking, though, that people are quarantining? Because it does sound to me like you are, by and large, depending on the goodwill of the British people.
Like all policing in this country, it's policing by consent, and that is the case. The division here is I deal with the quarantines, that side of things. Border Force will be the people who are the experts on the implementation of things like whether people are prosecuted. By and large, the system, though, is, as my wife found, is you get a call, it's a reminder, and we rely on people, as we do in all forms of policing, to do the right thing. With, I'm afraid, people who don't comply, finding they end up being fined, and in this case, get a criminal record. It's similarly actually on face coverings on public transport, where we've seen very, very high levels of compliance. But I have to say, it started off low at first, and it's become sort of 90%. And we do see fines, and we do see several hundred people receiving fines as a result. But by and large, people comply.
Would all of this just be made a lot easier if we had testing for coronavirus in airports when people arrived?
No, because although that sounds completely obvious, when people arrive and if you test them on day one, say at the airport, if they are asymptomatic, so they don't have any symptoms, and of course they shouldn't be traveling if they do anyway. So if they're asymptomatic, you would only pick up a small percentage of people who actually have coronavirus. So testing on the day is not secure. It doesn't replace quarantine. So what you then need to do is test a week later as well. And then you've got the issue of, by the time you've done that, 8 days is ideal, and then got a result, maybe 9 or 10 days, you're getting quite close to the 14 days. So
but it might mean that someone could go, but it might mean that someone doesn't have to be away from work for a fortnight.
Yes, it could cut it down to say 9 or 10 days. That's true. So
a Heathrow Airport on a highway to nothing then with their trial of this?
No, I'm working very closely with Heathrow. Their boss is called John Holland Kay, and I work with him and all the other airport bosses to try to find a system that will work. There's one other complication I want to explain as well, which is you just talked about how you know and how you can trust people to do the right thing. If you send out that second coronavirus test, let's say a week later, you've got to make sure that person doesn't just sort of dip it in a cup of tea. So to avoid that, do you require them to drive themselves to a test centre? And you can see how you've got to find a system which will actually be secure enough to replace 14 days quarantine and make it as every bit as accurate. So we are working on all of this, and I'm working with Heathrow and others. I'm very grateful that the tests they're doing are very helpful, and we'll say more about it when we're ready to do so. But people who say, why don't you just carry out this test? We'll all be relieved from it. You don't have to do the quarantine. I'm afraid that's more simplistic than the actual problem is to resolve.
We heard the news this morning that UK government debt has topped £2 trillion for the first time at the end of July 2020. That is more than 100% of gross domestic product. That is pretty bleak, isn't it?
Yes, it's much higher than the debt that we've had for many years, but it's not internationally particularly out of alignment. Even before this crisis, France, for example, had 100% of GDP as their debt level, and that was before coronavirus. It would be much higher now. Other countries, like I think Japan, has well over 200%. So it's not internationally particularly out of whack. But clearly, we have had to do a heck of a lot of things to try to ensure that the British economy, which is in recession, didn't go into a much deeper recession, losing far more jobs, and that involved, just as we would in a war, spending a lot of money to protect livelihoods. And I don't think anyone will ever regret us having done the right thing at the right time to do that.
It's been a testing week for your colleague Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary, and you've been at the centre of a political storm before. You've had to resign from government over a bullying scandal. I wonder, what is it like to be in that position, to be at the centre of such negative criticism, and have you given him any advice?
I haven't given him any advice other than you say if you're in politics for long enough, then you'll always have to go through difficult weeks. But when I resigned, which you mentioned, it was not from the job that I was even doing at the time, but just because I thought it was the decent right thing to do. But it was more of a sort of as a moral case, as it were, for me, and a very personal decision.
So is Gavin
For
Williamson not doing the decent right thing?
No, well, Gavin Williamson has been, if you look at not just what he's done, but what's happened in all four parts of the United Kingdom, he's trying to wrestle with something for which there isn't a straightforward answer, because the virus stopped people, including my twins, by the way, who got their GCSE results yesterday. It stopped them from doing their exams. And in that situation, there just isn't a solution. There isn't a perfect solution, perfect way out of it. And it's, I think, instructional that actually faced with this problem in all, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England, all four parts of the United Kingdom, and in the end, though not immediately, came to the conclusion that the best thing to do is to go on the teacher-guided results, which is what's happened. But let's not pretend that the choices facing the Education Secretary were unique to England or straightforward, because they were not. And I think it's important to get the right results for our kids. My kids are delighted. They've got their GCSEs and they'll be able to go on to study the A levels they want to do. So in the end, it's I hope comes to the right place.
Transport Secretary Grant Shapps, thank you very much for your time this morning.